So I'm glad that you chose to cover this, Mike. This is all something. This is all something that everybody's heard about, but maybe they're like me and you've only heard about it. You never really read into it or studied it much.
Yeah. Well, we've also had a lot of people write into us asking us to do a Lovecraft episode. So while this isn't exactly a Lovecraft episode, it's we're talking about one of his greatest creations, but maybe it wasn't his creation, ?
That's what we're here to discuss.
Yeah, that is what we're here to discuss.
And that's the Necronomicon. And for me, the way I view the Necronomicon, at first, I thought it was a book that summoned demons that possess dead bodies that are around log cabins.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Don't forget about the tree rape.
Nope. And then I thought it was a book of H.R. Geiger paintings.
Well, it was, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I think that's, just a collection of his paintings. They called the book that, as far as I know.
So it's not even based on, like, Lovecraft stuff or necromancy or anything like that?
I think all his shit was based on those things.
But I mean, like, specifically, like, there's no, like, Geiger Cthulhu or anything like that?
I don't know. That would be interesting to see.
I know the book itself is fucking expensive. I've wanted it for a while, but I think it's like $150 or more.
Damn.
Yeah, it's because it's out of print and they only did the one run and then that's that. So it's a collector's item now. But
let's get into the Lovecraft stuff. He first mentioned the Necronomicon in his short story, The Hound, right?
Yeah, I believe so. And he also wrote a history of it, I guess.
Yeah.
But it was like his history of it.
Yeah, he said the idea, like a lot of his things, came to him in a dream. Mm-hmm. And that's I love the name, the Necronomicon. I mean, you've heard it used in a ton of other things.
Yeah, like it's kind of like the default creepy evil magic book.
Yeah.
That's, if you need a book of unspeakable horrors, it's a Necronomicon. It's been used in so many different things, and it's just kind of taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, he suggested in his mythos anyway about this book that it was a Greek translation of a work in Arabic called Al-Azif. Al-Azif, okay. Mm-hmm. Written by Abdul Al-Zared, a.k.a. the Mad Arab, which is mentioned in a few of his writings.
Yeah.
But in Greek, I guess it translates to corpse law picture. But in H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, he said it translates to an image of the laws of the dead.
Yeah, and then it's also taken on the Book of Dead Names. That's another one that they've referred to it as.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And Al-Azif itself, that name is it's a word given to describe the sound of demon insects screaming in the desert wastes.
Whoa. That says a lot with one word.
Pretty heavy, intense shit.
Yeah, it says a lot with one word. Azif or Al-Azif?
Al-Azif.
Wow.
2 words, yeah.
So just give us a breakdown. What is this book in Lovecraft mythos?
So in the mythos, the Necronomicon was this book that contained the knowledge and rights to summon ancient powers, and also calling forth the elder gods. And so it had all the information about the mythos gods that he created, like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth and all that. And it was written by this character, Abdul Al-Hazred. And Al-Hazred kind of has his own history, which I'll get into as well. But for as far as Lovecraft goes, this book is often referred to. It's seldom seen in any of his stories. In the Dunwich Horror, one of the Whatley brothers breaks into Arkham University, which is kind of like, it's the college that, it's a fictional college that was made up by Lovecraft. But they've got a department that studies all this ancient god stuff, like they've got a copy of the Necronomicon. And so he breaks into the library there to steal the Necronomicon so that he can open the gate and let Yog-Sothoth through. But that's kind of the idea behind it. It's never really, in the stories, it's never really described what's in it. You'll get a few different lines here and there sprinkled through the stories, like the famous Cthulhu one, "Dead is dead, which does not lie, and in stranger eons even death may die." That's like probably the most famous one. Even Metallica uses it in a song.
They have a few Lovecraft songs.
Yeah, they do. Which is pretty cool. They're really I mean, they've got a song called "Call of Cthulhu," for God's sake.
Yeah.
But it's basically a book of unspeakable horrors, and it's referred to as much throughout the mythos. But like I said, it very rarely actually appears in any of the stories. And like all of his stuff, it's more in what is implied rather than what's actually described that creates the horror and the weirdness in his stories. But the book itself, like you said, he claims that it came to him in a dream. And I'll get into kind of further about that as we go on. But there's things that suggest that a book, if not the Necronomicon, but a book like the Necronomicon, may have actually existed. Now, I've got all this information about the book or I don't want to call it the Necronomicon itself, because I feel like that's just the name, like I said earlier, that is just given to any generic book that you want to be able to summon unspeakable horrors with. So there's evidence to suggest that a book like the Necronomicon may have actually existed.
Let's just go with Evil Book of Magic.
Evil book of demons and stuff. But it's like the Necronomicon itself, there's a lot of, I guess we'll say, historical haze surrounding it. And I'm not going to say what's real and what's fake. What I am going to say is I'm not making shit up here. This isn't something that I just concocted to do a show. But there are books out there. There's a number of Necronomicons that are out there. I can almost guarantee that none of them are the Necronomicon. They're just, I guess they're the Necronomicon in name only. You know, they range from hoaxes to just cobbled together books from other sources. Some of them include references to the Lovecraftian mythos. Some of them stand on their own. But there's actually a book out there called, I believe it's The History of the Necronomicon, or The Untold History of the Necronomicon. And in that book, it outlines basically just what the title would imply, the history of the Necronomicon. And it goes through a lot of time periods and points at things that are kind of similar to the Necronomicon before this Al-Hazred character would have been alive. There's also a lot of references. Like, it's a very well-researched book with a lot of references. I'm going to give you full disclosure. I did not follow up on any of the references. I saw that the references were there, but I did not follow up on them. So whether this is true information, partially true information, or a complete hoax, I'll let you guys do the research on that. And to me, it's more fun to kind of leave it open. You know, like it. I don't want a definitive answer. I want the mystery to remain alive. And if this history is true, then that's really cool and kind of terrifying. If this history is a complete fabrication, I enjoyed it nonetheless. I don't want to know. I want a little magic left in my world.
And that magic you want it to be?
And that magic I want to be eldritch magic, please.
The Book of the Dead.
Yeah. So I guess we can go all the way back to the Greek historian Ctesias. And he spoke of a strange, this strange magic that was being performed in Egypt. And he described rites that the ancient Egyptian used to halt the Persian expansion into Egypt. So the Greece had the Spartans, and Egypt had the Necronomicon, for lack of a better term. But they, according to him, they were able to perform these magical rites, and it stopped the Persian army from taking Egypt. They were able to defend their land from the Persians. But he went on to describe a meeting that he had with an Egyptian priest who described to him these ceremonies that they used to call on the gods of the Nile. And they would call on these gods to beg for the Nile to flood so that they would be able to farm. And they would work to increase the fertility during the farming season. And that's something that we all know about. The Nile was very important to the Egyptian culture. It was very closely tied in with their religious practices. But in addition to the Egyptian gods, Ctesias claimed that they also called out to Dagon, which is an ancient Babylonian god. And it's also a god that's referenced by Lovecraft, but the Lovecraftian version is like this giant fish man god that lives underwater. So he's kind of like he's not as powerful as Cthulhu, but they kind of share the same type of thing. These underwater gods.
Fish man.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's the deep ones that are fish people.
Mm-hmm.
They've got like the humanoid body, but webbed hands and feet and a fish head, basically.
Yeah.
But they called out to Dagon, and their belief was that if Dagon was not appeased, he would send his crocodile-bodied children out of the Nile to eat the farmers.
Ooh.
And apparently, in some translated texts, the priests of the god Set were known to chant, "That is not dead which can eternal lie," which is part of that couplet from the Call of Cthulhu.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this Egyptian book. It's called the Annales Maxima. And in this book, it references a hidden library that would move between the temples in Alexandria. And only a select few of the Egyptian priests, as well as Greek scholars, were aware of this secret library. And according to this book, the people that knew about the library were part of this hidden cult that practiced rituals that were older than ancient Egypt and even ancient Babylon. So they predated what we would know, what we, I don't really want to say we, but what as most people would consider the beginning of civilization. So if this predates the Mesopotamians, then this could go as far back. I mean, there's a lot of ideas that there was an ancient culture that existed on this planet before we're aware of, and they got wiped out somehow. And we've got sites like Göbekli Tepe, which are these huge, massive things, and that was like almost 12,000 years ago. And you've got the idea that the Sphinx is older, and that would be like 12,500 years ago at least that it would have been built, and the idea that the pyramids may be older as well. So this kind of goes in with that there's this civilization that had these ancient rites, and they were passed down through Mesopotamia and eventually ended up in ancient Egypt. But the cultist they referenced a couple different gods that kind of sound similar to Lovecraftian gods. So there's a god named Chautauqua and Lovecraft, as well as maybe Robert Campbell. I can't remember the other author, but they use this god named Chautauqua, so it's kind of similar.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also reference a god named Cthulhu, which obviously is similar to Cthulhu. And they were prophesized among these groups to return into power when the stars came right. So that's another thing that's echoed in Lovecraft's works. They always reference the stars need to be right for the ancient gods to return to power.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of goes in with that as well. But legend further states that there's a hidden library. The library that moved around actually ended up finding this permanent location. And it was in this place called the Timonium, which was this big theater district. And it was said that the library ended up here. All the books ended up here. And this was kind of where the scholars and the cultists would congregate to discuss the texts and study the texts. And in the current era, year 185, there was a bishop named Andros, and he kind of worked up his congregation and talked them into destroying the Timonium. And he claimed his reasoning behind it was that the Timonium was immoral and encouraged lustful behavior. But curiously, he also referenced that the Timonium was also a place where ancient darkness greater than Satan and older than Adam existed, and that if left unchecked, it would spread like the plague across the world.
Whoa.
So that's kind of interesting. To greater than Satan and older than Adam.
Yeah.
So predating existence, these things were around that he was afraid of. And as a bishop, I mean, you and I are both familiar with Catholicism. Satan is the enemy, and to say greater than Satan,
Yeah.
that's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, no kidding.
But this dude, Bishop Andros, a year after he incited the burning of the Timonium, he was accused of heresy himself, and he was sentenced to live in the desert among the demons. But he was able to somehow talk his way out of it, and rather than going into the desert, he returned back to Greece. But according to the legend about this secret library, the texts were saved from the burning of the Timonium, and they were moved to the capital of ancient Egypt, Memphis, which at this point was a lot of abandoned temples. There were temples to forgotten gods or lesser gods of the ancient Egyptians that they were empty now. So they kind of became the new meeting place for these occult activities and where they could study these forbidden texts and share ideas. And it was a relatively safe place because it was largely abandoned. So they just had to choose their place where they would meet, and they would meet in secret. And this is kind of how the information on the information that was contained in these works were spread. So we know about a lot of this because of this guy named William Chambliss, and he was an archaeologist from Brown University in the 1800s, and he was going on an exploration in Egypt in 1847, and he was studying Egyptian writing systems, and through his studies, he became convinced that the ancient Egyptians would be able to provide the key to secret ancestral knowledge that had somehow, for some reason, been intentionally forgotten. And so he started looking back into the old religion and started looking at a lot of the lesser gods that aren't referenced. You know, you've got the big gods like Isis and Osiris and Set and Horus and Anubis, but there's a lot of other gods that most people have never even heard of. So he starts looking into those, and he realizes that a lot of these lesser gods share a lot of similarities to the Greek Titans. And he, when he was looking through these religions, he began to look into the pharaohs themselves. And he found that the ancient Egyptians of Lower Egypt believed that the pharaohship itself had been a gift from the original god ruler Geb, and Geb gave it to the descendants of Horus. So it's like a divine gift passed down to a certain human so that they could rule Egypt. And based on his understanding, Chambliss believed that Geb held links to secret cults that were found in continents that spread across the world. And in his notes, he described that there was human sacrifice that was being done to Geb, and he kind of also referenced other dark gods, but didn't call them out by name. So that's an aspect of ancient Egypt that we're not really familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you hear about the human sacrifice in South America with the Aztecs, and they would tear the hearts out. But you don't, you know, that was thousands of years after ancient Egypt, and you don't really hear about human sacrifice in ancient Egypt. But he was writing about what he found in his studies, and he said that there were references to people sacrificing other people to Geb. But he references the dark gods, but doesn't explain who they are. But he learned from his studies and from individuals that he spoke with during his expedition that there was the destruction of these secret forbidden writings, the ones that I mentioned earlier that were in the library, the moving library, and then eventually they ended up in Memphis. But he said that what happened was they existed, they stayed intact for a long time after the Timonium. And it wasn't until British explorers started traveling to sites of ancient civilizations, going treasure hunting and sending archaeologists to dig up ancient buildings and all of that stuff, that these writings were actually destroyed. And the reason that they were destroyed, it was not by the treasure hunters. It was destroyed by the people that were protecting them. They would rather destroy these works than have them fall into the hands of someone who's not initiated into the rites.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than have them fall into the hands of a stranger, they destroyed them completely. Or did they?
Now, when I always hear about the destruction of libraries like that in history, it's always makes me cringe.
Yeah, like the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I mean, there's even theories with that they were moved to the chamber under the Sphinx.
Oh, really?
And and there's a lot of weird stuff with the Sphinx too, which I'm doing research now on a show about the Sphinx and the pyramids, so that'll be something coming up in the relatively near future.
Awesome.
But I'll get into that stuff then. I don't want to get into it too much now. But it's anytime that knowledge is destroyed, it's a bummer. You know, especially when it's destroyed out of fear. Like in this regard, I can understand you want to protect your for one, if they're dangerous, you definitely don't want them falling into the hands of someone who's not prepared for what it contains. And for two, you know, that's part of your identity, especially if you're part of this cult. That's who you are. That's what you're living for. And to let this information just fall into the hands of some foreign body is not anything that you want to deal with. So, I mean, I understand that.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. But were these texts, the Necronomicon, were these texts known to this Al-Hazred character? The character of Al-Hazred himself, his name's Abdul Al-Hazred. And apparently, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm sure you guys can gather I don't speak Arabic. Big surprise to most of you, I know. But apparently the name Abdul Al-Hazred is not correct. It's not a correct way of stating a name in Arabic.
Really?
So it wouldn't make sense as a name. Yeah. But there was a book written about this Al-Hazred character. And I don't believe that his name was actually Al-Hazred. I think it was kind of just using the name in reference to the Lovecraft character. But there was an actual biography written by a man named Ibn Khaldun, and he's from Syria, but he wrote a biography of him. So what we know about this character, I'm just going to call him Al-Hazred because he's never given an actual real name. He's just referred to as Al-Hazred. But according to the sources, he was born in the city of Sana'a, which is now Yemen. At the time, it was a huge influential city in the region, and it had big cities, like lots of. It was basically like a center of commerce, and they had their own culture and everything. But it's likely that it was here where he was raised that he would have first learned about astronomy and astrology. And from there, he would move on. According to the story, he went to Babylon, what was left of Babylon. This was after the rise of Islam. So, this is considerably closer to the future or to the present than ancient Egypt was. But he would have visited Babylon, which, as I'm sure most of you know, what was Babylon is now Iraq. But through his travels from Yemen to get to Babylon, it would have taken him through a good portion of the Arabian Peninsula. So he would have studied all the places in between and learned from there. But after that, he went to the abandoned city of Memphis, and it's not really clear what he did there. Most likely studied what he could find there. Maybe met up with other like-minded people and shared ideas. But then he spent 10 years alone in the Empty Quarter, which is also known as the Great Southern Desert of Arabia. And it's the largest continuous desert on the planet. And it's just called the Empty Quarter.
That's scary.
Yeah. I can't even. And in the biography, they talk about that, like how when he went there, it gave him perspective on what true emptiness was. You've got an idea in your head of what something that's empty would be. But when you look at the largest continuous expanse of desert on the planet, that's going to give you a whole new perspective. But when he was there, when he went to the desert, it's also unclear what happened. And after 10 years, he just kind of showed up in Damascus, which is in Syria. And he talked about communing with spirits and the jinn. And he mentions that he went to this plateau of Lang, which is also referenced in Lovecraft's work. And it's like this, it's this area in another dimension. It doesn't even exist in our reality. But he says he was able to go there. But according to the biographer Khaldun, Al-Hazred learned of the Empty Quarter and began to communicate with spirits as a child. And his uncle would take him into the desert, and they would talk to spirits in the desert together. And as his uncle began to teach him, he revealed to him that he himself was what they referred to as a speaker to night demons. And that Al-Hazred had the ability, because of his uncle having the ability. And so his uncle was going to teach him how to strengthen that. And through the communication with spirits, he learned of an ancient race that controlled Earth before man. So again, this calls back to these ancient rites and all these ancient buildings that and sites that predate Mesopotamia that are obviously not built by hunter-gatherers. They were built by some sort of civilization. And this kind of calls on that again. But by the time he was 13 years old, Al-Hazred was considered a man. And through his uncle, he was inducted into an organization known as the Brotherhood of Listeners, where he learned more about speaking with spirits, as well as more forbidden knowledge that was passed down through oral tradition only. So while he was learning this stuff, he was also completing his studies in astronomy, astrology, as well as the Quran. So he was learning about the Islamic faith and becoming well versed with the Quran. But he also continued speaking with spirits, and they told him to seek knowledge buried in places that once held power. So his first stop was to Memphis, because, like I mentioned, the legend was that the library ended up in Memphis, and since it was the abandoned capital of ancient Egypt, it was believed to still contain a lot of artifacts and texts that would contain power or knowledge. And he was told of this subterranean temple that existed near the necropolis of Memphis. So the necropolis is where the people were buried. But the Brotherhood of Listeners that he was inducted into, they had transcribed a lot of these texts into Greek, Latin, and Arabic. And they allowed certain scholars to come in and study them, but if they were to copy them or try to take anything away, they would hunt them down and kill them.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah, they believed that this information was so powerful that no man should be able to have the actual information. They were allowed to memorize it, but their belief was that the texts that they have should be memorized. And if it was going to be passed down, it will be passed down through oral tradition, and the texts would not be copied. They would not be transcribed, and they would not be given away. So he was able to study these texts while he was there, and whether or not he memorized them is open for debate, but the idea behind it is that he was able to retain most of this information, and this is kind of what formed the basis for what we'll call the Necronomicon. So after he studied in Memphis, he moved on to what was left of Babylon. So there's a legend that existed at the time that before the Babylonians worshipped Marduk and their other gods, they'd attempt to summon some sort of power to open up the gates between worlds. Now, anyone that's familiar with Lovecraft might think that sounds similar to Yog-Sothoth, because Yog-Sothoth is both the key to the other world as well as the gate. So you'd call upon Yog-Sothoth to open this gate. So that just kind of ties these ancient rites in with the Necronomicon further, because there's a being there that exists according to their tradition that is very similar to a being that Lovecraft wrote about. Now, I know you can say, like, there's any number of writers out there that have talked about these beings that guard the gates between dimensions, or, I mean, even you could say Saint Peter is one of those, in the Christian mythology. Saint Peter is there guarding the gates of heaven, and you need to get past Saint Peter to get in the gate. So in that regard, Saint Peter is the key. But he, at the time that Al-Hazred traveled to Babylon, it was largely abandoned. There wasn't much left. And so the question was, what was he doing there? And he may have been using some of the knowledge that he gained to try to look back into previous events in Mesopotamia, or try to go back, like astral travel, and for lack of a better term. And he would through astral travel, be able to go back and experience events that happened. So maybe he wanted to go back to see if they were successful in opening this gate, or maybe go back and talk to scholars or magicians that existed at the time and see if he could get their information. But it's not clear what he was doing in Babylon. But he did travel there, traveled throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And from Babylon, he went into the empty quarter. And he lived there, like I said, for 10 years and spoke with the jinn and the spirits of the desert before showing up in Damascus. And when he showed up, he said that he'd spoken with the spirits and he'd been to the plateau of Lang. And he also said he pulled back the yellow veil. And this again is a reference that is used in Lovecraftian stories. There's the King in Yellow, which Lovecraft actually borrowed from another writer from the 1800s. I can't remember the book that the Yellow King or the King in Yellow was from, but Lovecraft adopted it as kind of like a herald for Yog-Sothoth. So the reference to piercing the yellow veil might be looking through the gate that Yog-Sothoth presents.
Mm-hmm.
But he also spoke about creatures that were screaming under the ice on the southern continent, which would have been Antarctica. And again, this is another thing that's referenced in Lovecraft. In the Mountains of Madness, there's this ancient city that was found in Antarctica when they went on an Antarctican expedition. And they found bodies of these elder things and then these giant penguins. But then they ran into these Shoggoths, which are like these big, like, blob creatures. They're just kind of like this shifting mass of protoplasm and eye stalks and teeth, and they're just really creepy eye tooth blobs. And they were in Lovecraft's story, they were a race that was created by the Elder Things kind of as slaves, and eventually they revolted and fought against the Elder Things and took over the city in Antarctica. So this could be a reference to that. But he was driven by the madness of everything that was revealed to him, that he felt compelled to write this down, which broke the main rule of the Brotherhood. And the book that he wrote was based on information he gained through his travels, as well as things that he experienced. And he named the book Al-Azif, which, as I mentioned, it means the sound of demon insects screaming in the empty desert.
So he was kicking it with demon bugs for those 10 years?
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah, interesting.
He tamed them and rode them around like ponies.
Yeah. They loved him, they kept him warm. He was buddies with the demon insects. He had Fred and Herman and Facefucker. He loved all those guys. So since he wrote this stuff down, he broke the number one rule, and the punishment is death. But because he was part of a brotherhood, and because of the obvious power he had and the knowledge that he had, the brotherhood didn't feel like this was a job that they could accomplish by hiring an assassin. So what they did was go into the desert to converse with jinn. And they convinced a jinn named Al-Arag to kill Al-Hazred in exchange for the most beautiful virgin in Damascus.
I would do it too.
Ooh, give me that sexy virgin. I'll kill some motherfuckers. But in the Lovecraftian history of Al-Hazred, it was said that he was killed by some invisible creature in the middle of a marketplace.
Yeah, that's one of my favorites.
And he was torn apart.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in this biography, this character Al-Hazred, apparently the creature was Al-Arag, and he ate Al-Hazred in front of the marketplace while he was invisible. So just imagine what that would look like. Some invisible thing eating someone, and you just see bites being taken out. Like, that's scary as shit.
Yeah, they just float up to the air slowly, and they start to panic. They're turned sideways, and then just parts just disappearing while it bleeds profusely.
There's a it's a completely fictional book called Al-Hazred by, I think, Donald Tyson, maybe. But it's just called Al-Hazred if you guys want to read it. But it's fucking awesome. It's all about this character of Al-Hazred and his travels. And they don't get to his death, because he does die at one point, but he was able to be brought back through magic. But the actual death in the marketplace is not, the book ends before that, but they kind of set up for it, because he meets one of the star spawn of Cthulhu. He meets in a basement of some monastery, and they have it locked in this cage and surrounded by all these magical glyphs, so it can't get out. And he makes a deal with it that it shares knowledge with him, and he will free it. So the thing gives him the knowledge, and then Al-Hazred's like, "Fuck you," when he just leaves.
Oh.
And the thing swears it's going to get his revenge and whatnot. So it's kind of cool. They set up for that. It's a massive fucking book. It's like Bible sized.
Oh, really?
Gargantuan, yeah. But anyway, back to the Necronomicon. After the death of the Al-Hazred character, it's thought that all of what all of his research and things that he wrote was taken by people from the Brotherhood, but that some of it got looted. And there were two men that began to study some of his work, and through this they were able to start communicating with spirits. And upon finding out about this practice, the two men were ordered to be executed by the rulers of Damascus. And when they tried to kill them, they first tried to behead them. They ordered them both to be beheaded, but the executioner's axe would not even pierce their skin.
Whoa.
So then they ordered them to be hanged. And when they were being hanged, the entire time they were mocking the crowd that had gathered. And they let them stay up there for a time that should have broken anyone's neck. Nothing happened with them. So they cut them down, and they put him in a pen with a wild boar. And it said that they just sat there and stared at the wild boar, and that the wild boar headbutted the door of the cage until it cracked its own skull open.
It committed Harry Carey?
Yeah.
Whoa.
So eventually the rulers of Damascus were like, fuck this, get the fuck out of Damascus and don't come back. So they were banished to Constantinople, where they then went and furthered their studies in the occult, as well as becoming teachers.
So they pass on the knowledge then.
Yeah. They became further ingrained in the occult society and began to teach people in Constantinople some of this stuff. But at the time, that the religious opposition in Constantinople would have forbidden them from practicing this, let alone teaching it, but they did it anyway. As the story goes, they finally met their end. The rulers of Constantinople, after not being able to execute them, ordered that they be locked in a cage and have the cage lowered into a river. And they had someone watch the cage for 2 days, and the cage never came back up. No one ever left the river. So they assumed that they had finally died. But apparently there was like some haunting activity in the area from then on. Yeah. So maybe their spirits still wander. But there was this man by the name of Theodorus Philetus. This character may or may not be fictional. There's no historical references to him, and if you look him up, most references to him are tied to the Necronomicon fiction. So it's very possible that he was a character that was just created at some point along the way when all this crazy mythology was being put together. But according to the biography of Alhazred, this guy Theodorus Philetus was able to translate the book 2 centuries after the death of Alhazred in Constantinople. And when he translated it, he renamed it the Necronomicon, or the Book of Dead Names. And once his translation was made available, interest in mystical practices increased. And people in the area of Constantinople began selling charms and potions and, basically like snake oil salesmen, claiming that these were things that were taken from the pages of the Al-Azif and that they had mystical cures and curses and, whatever magical thing you wanted, they were able to produce. But eventually the rulers of Constantinople banned the contents of the book, and the ruler ordered all copies to be destroyed. But of course, some survived. They were hidden away in secret. And at this point, we don't hear anything more about these texts until the Crusades. And when the Knights Templar went over, they discovered copies of the text and ultimately were responsible for bringing them back to Europe. What had happened was there were three of the Templar Knights deserted the order, and they deserted the order after they had found these books. And their intention was to go back to their homelands, which was England, France, and Spain. And they wanted to go back and they wanted to see what they could get for these texts, basically.
Oh, so it's like they stole them, huh?
Yeah. And, well, not exactly. It was the Crusades, so I guess in a way, yeah, they stole them. But it was said that they paid for them, but where did they get the gold from? It was most likely taken from the same village they bought the text from.
Yeah.
So they, on their way back to their homelands, when they made a stop in Italy, I believe Florence maybe, I can't remember exactly, but they made a stop in Italy. And once they were there, they were notified that they had been excommunicated by the church and would no longer be welcome in their homelands.
Whoa.
And they were excommunicated because they deserted. So the Spanish knight, even though he had been excommunicated and banned from returning home, he decided to go back anyway. And this knight is known only as Alberto. But he went home to Spain with the intention of using his copy of the Necronomicon to buy forgiveness. And his fate was never recorded, so what happened to him is unknown.
Oh.
But he gave his copy of the book to the local Templar order, and that's the last you hear of Alberto. The other 2 knights ended up traveling to Switzerland, and they shared the information with a group of radical monks who later founded a college, which will factor in later. But they shared the information with the monks, and apparently they lived in Switzerland until these knights lived in Switzerland until their deaths. But the Knights Templar, that's another thing we should do a show about sometime, because there's so much weirdness surrounding them, and they started out as a holy order, but they're tied to like all these magical things, and at one point they're said to have been the ones that took the Ark of the Covenant and hid it away somewhere. But then there's other things saying that they're tied in with demons and the devil, and it's crazy. But in 1300, the Order of the Knights Templar was finally dissolved. And when the order was dissolved, all of their property was dispersed among local authorities, and anything like books and things like that were donated to colleges or academics. So if they had a copy of the Necronomicon, chances are it would have went to one of the colleges or one of the universities in the area.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll fast forward a bit to the 1500s. And are you familiar with John Dee?
Yes, a little bit.
He was a famous wizard. Basically, he was born in 1507 and lived to 1608. So he was 101 when he died, and in that time period, he may as well have been 1,000. Like during that time period, if you lived to 50, you were a fucking old man, and he lived double that time. But he served as advisor and astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, the original recipe Queen Elizabeth. And it's thought that John Dee was able to get his hands on a Greek copy of the Necronomicon, and he translated it to English and was able to use the power that he found within this text to help Elizabeth gain power over the Spanish. And in the early process of translating the work, one of his proteges by the name of Simon Forman would correspond with John Dee regarding the translation of the book, and they often referenced a mysterious Arab who would be this Al-Hazred character.
Mm-hmm.
And in Dee's diaries, he claims that the two parted ways due to Simon's greed and what he referred to as dark subtlety. So it sounds like maybe the Simon character was lusting for power or wanted to start doing things on the darker side.
Uh-huh.
But he didn't really elaborate on that.
Very interesting.
But he, after the two had separated and parted ways, John Dee continued to translate these texts, and he started doing it with the help of his apprentice Matthew Lynn. But this work was never completed. Now, when he was still communicating with Simon Forman, this Matthew Lynn apprentice would kind of be his gopher, and he would use Matthew to deliver letters and spread information back and forth between John Dee and Simon Forman. In 1585, Matthew Lynn quit working with John Dee, and he signed on with a group of British settlers to go to the New World. And it was an all-male group of settlers, and the colony that they founded was Roanoke, Virginia.
Whoa.
Yeah. The weird thing about that is, though, that, so you're familiar with the Roanoke mystery, I'm assuming.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so for anyone that's listening that isn't aware, Roanoke was a colony where all the settlers just mysteriously disappeared. There was never a trace found of them, and no one knows to this day what happened to them. There was no written indication. There was no evidence. Everyone just disappeared.
Actually, have you heard about the stones they found?
No.
Verbal Distillery just did a really good episode on this, but pretty much they can conclude that these stones that they found had messages scratched into them, and they said that they were attacked. They even had a lady who signed them, so left her initials, and it matched up with one of the initials of one of the wives of one of the settlers. But
interesting.
They said they were attacked. They waited because it was right before a bunch, more than half of them left, right?
Yeah, I think they went back to get supplies. They went back to England, and when they came back, everyone that was left behind was gone.
Yeah, I think the stones said something to the effect of they watched all of them leave, so they just went and wiped out the rest of the remaining people that were in the colony.
Who? The natives?
Uh-huh.
Or was it creepy Cthulhu monsters?
Fish dudes.
The Yog-Sothoth sucked them into the gate. Yeah, but John Dee wasn't happy about any of this. And in a diary entry, he stated that
this was all bullshit.
This is bullshit, damn it. But he was upset because he felt that Matthew Lynn had betrayed him and taken copies of what he referred to as his great work that they had worked on together. So this would have been his translation of the Necronomicon. But I'll read a quote from his diary. With the pages he carries, Matthew might call up such a power as none in this world might resist.
Whoa. He took the good stuff.
Yeah. And then after learning about the fate of the Roanoke colony, he wrote in his diary, God wrought that ever came this cursed text of rotting names into my sight. Surely it were better that Lynn had been tied with a millstone and drowned even as a newborn babe. I am minded to destroy the papers entire ere I show them to another such as I. So he apparently planned to destroy them, but there is a John Dee translation of the Necronomicon out there. That being said, it could be one of those bullshit hoaxes. There's really, you can't really say with any amount of certainty whether it's the authentic book or not, but it's referred to as John Dee's Necronomicon. So maybe he destroyed it, maybe he didn't, maybe it's now available on Amazon. But here's a fun fact, though. So I said that John Dee had the Greek copy, and he translated the Greek into English. The weird thing is that the Necronomicon, or whatever these texts were translated to English before they were ever written in Latin.
Whoa.
Yeah, weird, right?
Yeah.
There was this guy named Olus Wormius, who was also referred to as Ol Worm. He lived from 1588 to 1654. But he was the one that actually ended up translating it into Latin. And it was the guy, the guy was smart. He was a Danish anatomist, he was a physician, and he was a naturalist. And he translated it to Latin because he's a fucking hipster. Because Latin is like, even though it was a dead language at the time, well, I guess it wasn't. The Catholic Church still used it, but it wasn't a language. It was like the if you were a smart guy, you knew Latin. So in order to show how smart he was, he's like, oh, we need to translate it into Latin. So he translated it into Latin. Now this is where we get back to Switzerland, because he was studying in Basel, Switzerland, which is where one of these universities that the monks founded, the monks who got the copies of the Necronomicon from the two exiled Templars. So they founded a university in Basel, and he was studying in Basel in the 1600s, and he was able to study one of the copies that had been brought there by the Templars, and he started to translate it. In addition to translating it in Latin, he also began to write a manuscript for a German translation, but he never completed it, so it just remained a manuscript. Now, just a quick side note about what was going on in Switzerland in the mid 1600s. There were Swedish agents that ended up going to Damascus, and they were ordered to be burned at the stake. Or I'm sorry, not Damascus. They went to Denmark, and they were ordered to be burned at the stake by King Frederick III of Denmark. And their crime was powerful witchcraft in the manner of Ol Worm. So this happened after Olus Wormius. This happened after Olus Wormius's death, and they were being compared to him for practicing this magic work, whatever the magic was. But this story goes that with them they had a copy of the Latin Necronomicon, and that was burned with them when they were burned at the stake. But as I mentioned, the German transcript was never completed, but it did end up in the library of Prince Elector of Bavaria, Charles Theodore. And this was in the mid 1700s. So this was 100 years after these individuals were burned, and 100 years after Olus Wormius was after he died. But it ended up in Charles Theodore's library. It's very likely that this Theodore guy didn't even know the significance of what he had. The reason being, he was a nerdy comic book collector, basically. He would go around and buy these ancient, obscure manuscripts and then just put them in his library, and they would sit there. So he ended up with the German manuscript from Olus Wormius that was never completed, but never read it, didn't even know what he had.
Wow.
His library passed down to his son, and his son actually ended up ascending the throne and becoming king of Bavaria. So the contents of this library from that point on passed from king to king, and a century later, King Ludwig of Bavaria would ascend to the throne. And having access to this library, it's thought that he may have began to read the German manuscript. And Ludwig was historically known for being insane. He went crazy at some point during his reign. He wasn't crazy before his reign, or at least he didn't show any signs of being crazy in any way, but apparently during his reign he lost his shit. And a lot of people thought that it was due to decades of inbreeding within the family, or generations of inbreeding within the family. But there's some that suggest maybe that he was, I feel like Ancient Aliens. Is it possible that King Ludwig studied the Necronomicon? But some theorize that he may have been studying this manuscript, and that learning about all of this information that he had never even heard of, and learning of the vastness of the universe and the strangeness of reality, that his brain broke. Damn. So just to give an example of his madness, he had this amazing castle built. It was called, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so forgive me, but I think it's Neuschwanstein Castle. And he built it on top of this mountain. The reason he built it up there was because he believed ancient creatures lived beneath the mountain, and it was his duty as king to fight them. And he wrote a letter to his tutor, and I'll read a piece of the letter. He says to his tutor, "Surely a beast more ancient and foul than Fafnir." For those that don't know, Fafnir is a dragon in Norse mythology. "Surely a beast more ancient and foul than Fafnir sleeps below these rocks. His is among the Toten Namen. As king, am I not bound as Siegfried to use what is at my disposal to protect my people?" And again, Siegfried is a hero in Norse mythology. But after Ludwig's death, his uncle took the throne, and shortly after ascending the throne, the library was burned in an apparent accident. But there's those out there saying that his uncle intentionally burned it in order to destroy and purge whatever had made the king go mad. Mm-hmm. So that kind of brings us up to it was the mid 1700s, but then from there we know that through Roanoke there was a copy in the New World, and there is a reference to a Matthias character. Now, remember, the apprentice was Matthew Lynn. So Matthew, Matthias. Matthias just sounds like a cool wizard name for someone named Matthew. But there's reference of this character named Matthias who showed up in Jamestown after it had been founded. He just kind of showed up, and they described him as having a luxurious beard and thick eyebrows. So he sounds like a wizard. And that he had great power, great magical power. So we know that there's that copy in the New World, and then another one shows up. It was likely a translation, and apparently you're not going to be told if you call and ask, but apparently there are secret copies of these texts at Brown University as well as Harvard University, and only certain people are allowed to even know that they exist, let alone view them.
In modern day?
Right.
Oh, wow.
And that's where that's where Lovecraft may have gotten this idea from. In his stories, he's got a character named Randolph Carter. And apparently this character, Randolph Carter, was named after one of his grandfather's friends. And he would often go and spend time at his grandfather's house with his mother. And sometimes he would kind of listen in on his grandfather's conversations. His grandfather, a lot of his friends were scholars and professors at Brown University. And so the thought is that since Brown had a copy of these manuscripts, that maybe at some point Lovecraft's grandfather and his friends were talking about it, and he overheard this. He overheard talk of this, and maybe they referred to it as the Necronomicon. Maybe that was something he came up with. I don't know, but it's possible that this idea started hearing these men talk about these forbidden texts.
Wow, can you imagine him creating something like that and having it being true because it was something that he heard and not dreamt?
Yeah. But there's also another theory that that this book might be a non-physical book. Are you familiar with the Akashic records?
No.
It's these records that they're non-physical. You can only get to them through intense meditation or magical practice, but it's supposed to hold all knowledge of everything. Basically, all the knowledge that anyone or any idea of a god would have are stored in the Akashic records. So it would have a record of the creation of Earth. It would have a record of you taking a dump. It would have a record of the hurricanes being erected. That time you picked your nose in the back of class and thought nobody saw it, that's in the Akashic records.
Wow.
It's there. Yeah. So it's thought that this book exists in the Akashic records, and that through certain things, whether it be astral projection or meditation or magical work or maybe even hallucinogen use, that if you know what you're looking for and you practice enough and you can have enough control and focus, you can access this information. And the information contained within the Necronomicon, or what we call the Necronomicon, or other similar spell books or summoning books or whatever, that they can be tapped into and accessed. So rather than having a written transcription of these things, you are able to access it with your mind. Or maybe in Lovecraft's case, it accessed him. Maybe he, just through hearing about these, he started dwelling on it and that opened his mind up. So maybe this dream was actually like a download from the Akashic records into his brain.
Yeah.
And he kind of just brought it forward into modern consciousness. And so now it's a thing. I mean, we've got... So let me jump back for a minute to remember the Simon Foreman character?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the most famous Necronomicon that's out there is Simon's Necronomicon. Nobody knows who this Simon character is. It just kind of showed up in paperback in the 70s. And it was published through Avon Publishing and I think Penguin as well. And, it's like the equivalent of Milton Bradley putting out the Ouija board. It's being published by these well-known publishers, and it's have you ever seen the Simon Necronomicon or like looked through it or anything?
No.
It's got the famous star on the cover, and it just says Necronomicon. And there's a few different cover versions of it. Some are leather bound, some have like weird designs on it, but it always has the star, and it just says Necronomicon. And it's attributed to this guy named Simon. And it's got kind of like a loose tie to the mythos. It references this mad Arab who went through these travels and experienced all this crazy shit. But then it gives you like real spells and real rites to perform and has sigils that you can draw and symbols of protection and then how to summon these ancient beings. And nobody knows really who the Simon character is. So I'm curious. And a lot of people put it off as being a hoax that just showed up in the 70s. But the name Simon is interesting. And there's the Simon Foreman character who John Dee said had dark subtleties and who was greedy. So maybe he kept some of these translations that he was working on with John Dee and passed them on, or maybe sold them off. And maybe at some point in time they were collected together, and in the 70s it was published as Simon's Necronomicon. Because I mean, it seems weird, and it's definitely not impossible by any means, because at the time in the 70s, the Lovecraft mythos wasn't anywhere near what it is today. I mean, you can't go anywhere without seeing a reference to Lovecraft.
Uh-huh.
You know, even Cthulhu has entered into our toy stores now. It's Cthulhu's everywhere. He's in fucking South Park, for Christ's sake. And so, I mean, the Lovecraft mythos is a huge part of our modern consciousness, and a lot of people don't even know it. They see this stuff and they're just, you know, most people are familiar with who Cthulhu is at this point. Do they know his origins? Do they know the story? No, probably not. But you show them the image of Cthulhu, most people are going to know what that is.
Uh-huh.
But in the 70s, it wasn't like that. So it's weird that they would come out with the Necronomicon and kind of tie it in with the mythos. What if it's real? What if it's not just a hoax? What if it was just kind of put out there, and because it was done in mass publishing, I think like 800 million copies of it have been sold. And there's occultists that have looked through it, and some claim that it's complete bullshit. Some claim that it's cobbled together pieces from ancient Babylonian texts, and these were ancient Babylonian rites that have been translated into English and published as the Necronomicon. But what if it is the real thing? What if this was part of John Dee's translation into English, and it was just kind of passed on by the Simon Foreman guy?
Well, if he was working with them, I mean, he could have easily just copied each page as he got them, wrote it all down.
Exactly. And nobody knows who this Simon guy is. And it's called Simon's Necronomicon. It's not attributed to any specific author. It references Aleister Crowley's work, and it references Lovecraft's work, but then it also references this Babylonian stuff. So maybe these are those ancient rites that were talked about that predated Mesopotamia, that predated ancient Egypt. And because it's just in mass market paperback, it's just looked at as being a novelty.
Mm-hmm.
I actually saw a walkthrough of the Warrens Museum with a news reporter from, I think it was from the 80s. It might have been the early 90s, so I can't remember. But they were going through and he was explaining about the Annabelle thing. But he had a copy of Simon's Necronomicon in his in the museum. He's got a leather-bound copy of it.
Wow.
And the news reporter asked about it, and he said it was, what he said was, I mean, it was complete. It sounded like it came from a place of complete ignorance, because he called it a book of shadows, which a book of shadows that's like a Wicca thing, you know, like the New Age witchcraft type stuff where you put like healing spells and poetry and things like that. It's not grimoire, but he claims that people have used that book and have been able to summon demons with it and have had problems, and he's had to deal with them. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about the Warrens on the show before, and my opinion is that they're largely full of shit. I don't know if your opinion is any different than mine or the listeners, but that's my personal opinion. Anything that they have to say, I take with the largest grain of salt that's humanly possible.
I'd have to agree. They're in the same boat with me.
Yeah. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, because that was completely independent of this research. I just happened to be watching watching I can't even. I think it was about the Annabelle doll. I was watching something about that, and they just showed this clip of a tour, and he had Simon's Necronomicon. I'm like, oh wow, that's a fun little piece of synchronicity.
Yeah, it's trying to reach out to you now, dude. Watch out.
It probably is. I'm gonna become the new fucking mad scribe, and I'm gonna go off the deep end and go move to the desert and scream with the demon insects in the middle of the night.
Yeah, great.
And I'll write you letters filled with creepy runes. And then you'll read them and your eyes will bleed and you'll fart bugs.
And then teleport to the desert where you're at and raise it like a...
Nope. Instead, a hole's going to open up and you'll be sucked into the Middle Ages. Except you won't have a boomstick.
Aw.
So, have fun in that pit, Mateo.
So with how old all religions are, I mean, as long as there's been people, they've had a religion. And if all these religions have had writings from God, as a lot of them claim, or about God, even if it's not something that God wrote himself or passed down or, for people to write, doesn't it only make sense that there's a book about the other side of that equation, be it the devil or the dead or demons?
Well, who's to say it's really the other side? What if it's the same thing? What if these things are all like not the same being, but the same thing? Like whatever entity Yahweh was, what if that entity, or what if whatever that is also Geb or Ra or Odin? They're all parts of like in Lord of the Rings with the wizards. How they're all they're not human. They're that ancient race of powerful beings, and they're just called wizards, but they're ancient. They're much older than the beings of Middle Earth. So like, what if that's and that's what like Ancient Aliens is pointing to as they're calling them ancient aliens. They're extraterrestrials that came down to help mankind, but they're all these beings, and depending on where they were in the world, they were looked at as being the god or gods that were there. Maybe sometimes it was a group of them that wanted to land and party with the locals. Like, oh my God, it's a whole bunch of gods. But then Yahweh was a dick to everyone else. They're like, fuck that, just go throw him over in the desert somewhere. And so he ended up in Egypt and helped free the Jews. And he's like, no, I'm the creator and I'm the only God, and you can't talk to any other gods because it's just me. And they're like, but we've been to somewhere else and we know that there's other gods. No, worship me or no damnation. Well, I don't want no damnation, so I'll worship you. Cool. I'll help you get out of Egypt then. After I kill a bunch of babies. Is that necessary? Shut up. I am the god and I will kill the babies. Oh, okay. Kill the babies. We'll kill all these lambs and spread their blood. You're kind of violent, God. Shut up and worship me.
Kill the babies.
Kill the babies. So maybe like the beings that are talked about in these texts are just more of the same. Or maybe they're talking about some, like in the case of this being that's able to open the gate between the worlds. Maybe this is something even greater than these beings. Maybe this thing is what opens the world between where these beings come from and where we exist. So maybe all these other gods are reliant on Yog-Sothoth in order to come over into our world. Maybe he's their spaceship, their Merkaba. Or whatever, however you want to refer to it. It's him.
That's interesting because, I don't know, if we were going to talk about it being the same entity, they talk about it being something more evil than Satan, like you had mentioned. Or
no, he said greater than Satan.
Greater than Satan. And that's
right. Which to me means more powerful than.
Yeah. But he used something negative to describe it. So do you think that if it's obvious?
But you also got to think that he was a Catholic bishop.
Mhm.
So, to him, anything that's magical or not of his God is automatically inherently evil.
Ah, okay.
So you have to look at it in the context of who's stating that as well.
Very true. So how expensive would it be to get any copies of any of these Necronomicons?
Well, what do you mean by Necronomicon? Like any of the fakes?
Or
'Cause
whatever.
you can go buy Simon's Necronomicon for under $10.
Oh,
I've
really?
got a copy right now. Yeah,
Really?
yeah.
Have you read into it at all?
A few times. It's something. I first actually got into the Necronomicon itself before I even know who Lovecraft was. As a former ICP fan, you recall Dark Lotus, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if you followed the stuff leading up to the release of their first album, but they referenced that it was a lot of the content in the album was taken from the Necronomicon.
Really?
And it was Violent J's brother used to be in the military, and while he was over in the Middle East, he was able to obtain a copy, and he brought it back with him. And they even mention the Necronomicon a couple of times on the album as well. But reading the interviews with him leading up to the release of that, and he was talking about it, I was like, what? I really wanted to look up what the Necronomicon was, because all that I knew about it at that point was from the Evil Dead movie. So I just assumed it was something created for the movie. And so I looked it up, and I found Simon's Necronomicon, and I ended up buying that, and I read that, and it completely captivated my imagination. I like it, just the story of this guy roaming the deserts, talking to spirits, and getting magical knowledge. It was fucking awesome. And so like I knew about Simon's Necronomicon before I even knew about Lovecraft.
Wow.
And then I found out about Lovecraft, and I was like, oh shit. Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But there's a ton there's the John Dee translation, which you can also get on Amazon. And again, I don't know if it's actually John Dee's. I do not have that. I haven't read it, so I don't know. The guy that wrote that Al-Hazred book, Donald Tyson, he built his own Necronomicon based on the book, based on Al-Hazred. So it kind of follows what Al-Hazred did in the book, but adds in like some chants here and there and some symbols and stuff. And then there's any number of fakes that are out there. I mean, you can go on Etsy and look up Necronomicon, and you'll find these really creepy looking pages that you can buy. And you buy by page, but it's like a really nice piece of artwork, and it just looks like this old aged page from some creepy magical book. But
wow.
Yeah. I mean, it really depends on how much you want to spend. You can get a really nice leather bound copy of Simon's Necronomicon, but it's going to cost you.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's similar books. Like, so if you're not looking at the Necronomicon, but you want something similar, there's the Goetia, which is based on magic that was allegedly done by King Solomon to bind demons. I have this other book called the Book of Smokeless Fire, which is a book for summoning the 72. They're basically what were referred to as demons to Solomon, but they were jinn. And it's a book on how to summon the 72 worst jinn that exist. So like yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of different stuff out there like that. Some of it's real magic work. Some of it is complete fabrication. Some of it's a mix between the two.
Let's pretend that the good guys mixed up the text so they don't really work anymore. Since you can buy it on Amazon.
Yeah. Well, you can buy a lot of magic books on Amazon though.
Oh, but I don't know if any are supposed to contain shit greater than Satan.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably all a matter of opinion as well. Because what if Satan doesn't even exist?
Yeah.
Anything would be greater than Satan, right? And then what do you mean by greatness? Do you mean power? Do you mean like maybe like he's a party guy? Like, hey, Satan's great, man.
Coolness.
I partied with him last Tuesday. And apparently these guys know some spirits even greater than Satan. So, let's see what they're all about. Let's give them a call. So I don't know. It's just here's what I want to end on. If any of you guys out there, and I know that there's some crazy motherfuckers out there, but if any of you guys out there want to dabble in this stuff, first of all, don't. Second of all, if you really feel like you have to, you really do your fucking homework. Don't just go from being a guy working at a paper factory to fucking Wizard Supreme trying to summon Cthulhu. Like, baby steps, man. This is some significant shit. And honestly, in all reality, meddling with this stuff just opens doors. It's like the Ouija board. It's like doing seances. You're willingly opening a door. And unless you have the ability and the know-how to close the door that you're trying to open, don't do it. Even if they're not, even if what you're doing is not real in the sense that it was used by ancient people in the past, a lot of it has to do with intent. And if your intent is to pierce the veil, is to contact the other side, there's going to be something looking back at you. It can attach to you, and like in our episode with John Capiz, possession is real, and there's different levels of it, and whether you believe it's a demon or a spirit or a ghost, whatever, this type of thing happens. There's long history of belief in this and referenced occurrences of this sort of thing happen. So you open that door, you willingly look across to the other side, look across to another reality, you're going to have something looking right back at you. So unless you're prepared to deal with that and have the know-how to do it, don't fuck around.
Yeah, I mean, in this book, if it tells you how to summon Cthulhu, I mean, obviously you're not going to summon Cthulhu, but there could be other things that, I don't know, maybe tune in on that type of energy. So you never know what
and a lot of it's negative. You're not going to accidentally summon like a super sex angel. It's just, you might want to, it might first appear that way, but it's going to be some sort of entity that's draining energy from you at the very least.
Yeah.
So, if you get that inkling, just throw in the Evil Dead and chill, okay? For me, guys, please.
Thank you for listening to the Whatcast. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, iTunes, and YouTube. Enjoy the podcast. Get yourself a Whatcast t-shirt or a sticker pack. Who was that dude on that one episode? Try the links in Homie's page. All this and more can be found at www.thewhatcasters.com. Thanks again for listening and have a great week.